is going to be published. Again, I'm happy to send it to you, but I guess you better not share it around. So it's based again on John Taylor, An Adventure of the Imagination, which is a John Taylor phrase from his book, The Primal Vision. And we like to think of mission as an adventure of the imagination. So here we go. Basically, the stories throughout this one are my story, interspersed with various scholars. I'm writing this during lockdown 3.0 in the UK. It's nearly a year since the beginning of the first lockdown, and we are weary. It's clear that people have found this lockdown much harder than the previous two. It's winter, so it's dark and cold. The numbers of people dying each day are horrendous, so that now we are grateful when the death toll is merely hundreds and not thousands. We are still experiencing the awkwardness of physical distancing, wearing masks, and Zoom fatigue is more real than ever. We may not be sleeping well. Tasks that used to be simple now take on different proportions. We may feel anxious and stressed much of the time. We can only leave our homes under certain conditions. For many women and children in our world, home is the least safe place for them. So what must this be like under yet another lockdown? We cannot meet with others as we used to, spontaneously and freely, over the meal table in parks or cafes, churches, playing sport. Our usual ways of relating have been disrupted and disabled. And then there is time. It feels as if we're in a time out of time. Some days stretch out before us, empty, long and lonely. For others, they pass in a frenzy of entertaining or homeschooling children, endless time on screens, unhelpful media coverage, until by the end of the day, we're exhausted and miserable. We are trying to live one day at a time in a world we no longer recognize. This seems to be more challenging than we had ever imagined. Trauma does affect us. Recent trauma studies have alerted us to the fact that trauma affects our bodies and minds, our space, and how we inhabit time. One of the powerful effects of trauma in individuals and communities is that connections are broken and assumptions about how the world is supposed to be are shattered. With all this in mind, how do we do mission during and after COVID, and how can we dare to call this an adventure after so much global suffering? How do we cope with and navigate change, which for most of us in the West at least, is of such unprecedented proportions? In a podcast on the prophetic imagination, beloved Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann offers a fascinating perspective on change. He speaks of it in terms of disruptions, and he explains this. He says, we think in terms of systems and continuities and predictability and schemes and plans. I think the Bible is, to some great extent, focused on God's capacity to break those schemes open and to violate those formulae. When they're positive disruptions, the Bible calls them miracles. We tend to not use that word when they are negative. But what it means is that the reality of our life and the reality of God are not contained in most of our explanatory schemes. I do not want to minimize the amount of suffering the pandemic has caused, but this reframing may help us to call on our imaginations and to see this as an adventure, literally an adventure, literally something or somewhere that we will arrive at, albeit in an ongoing fashion. I imagine that this will be an ongoing adventure, an ongoing arrival at, as our schemes, plans, and formulae have been so radically disrupted. Or we could think of it as an upheaval and a catalyst for change. Spirituality writer Margaret Silf reminds us that in the beginning, we recall the Spirit hovered not over order, but over chaos, bringing forth a new creation. So what follows is a personal reflection drawing on my own experience during the pandemic, from which I'm going to draw out three missiological themes. These are lament, the neighbourhood, and what it means for mission to treasure limited means. So the first one, lament. The very first thing we may need to do now and in the time to come is lament. So much suffering and trauma can only call for lament. Ugandan Roman Catholic theologian Emmanuel Katongole reminds us that the Israelites were not strangers to lament. Indeed, nearly 1/3 of the Psalter is made up of psalms of lament. Lament means that we can articulate and name our trauma before God. And in the Book of Lamentations, we hear 5 voices not only naming the pain, but also encouraging the listeners to sit with it. Their disaster was not something to rush away from. It was something to name, to sit with, to challenge, to question, to reflect on. Intriguingly, it is God who does not speak throughout the entire Book of Lamentations, and that is challenging. Why is God silent in such a time of crisis? North American Old Testament scholar Kathleen O'Connor believes that God's silence in this book is inspired and that it allows space for human speech, touch, and healing. She notes God's silence in Lamentations leaves wounds festering, open to the air, and possible to healing. The benefit of exposed
Oh dear, we seem to have lost Cathy.
wounds. Can you hear me?
Oh, Cathy, you just froze for a bit, but
I
hope you're back.
Yeah, actually it's saying my internet connection is unstable, but
there we go. You're back. Yeah.
Okay, so I was just reading the quote. So left exposed, they require us to see, acknowledge, and attend to them, the wounds. And Kathleen O'Connor also claims that it prevents us from minimizing or sliding over the pain into happy endings. If mission is about the renewal and healing of all creation, then surely lament is something that we can both receive and offer now and later. There will continue to be much loss, grief, heartache, and sadness. We've all experienced this. We can draw on our own biblical resources and encourage one another to lament. We can affirm that in circumstances like these, it's normal to be sad. Sadness and grief are part of the human condition, and we need to learn to embrace this. In a lovely metaphor expressed as wintering, English writer Catherine May explains, but if happiness is a skill, then sadness is too. As adults, we have to learn the clarity of its call. This is wintering. It is the active acceptance of sadness. The ability to sit, to be sad, and to lament is important. We need to be able to express our pain, to sit alongside, and to share in this together. However, lament can also be a form of resistance that can lead to protest and to hope. A good example of this is the African American gospel songs, the slave spirituals. They were a powerful expression of their belief that God was with them in their suffering. The slave songs are drenched in pain and in sadness, but they also express a spirit of resistance, confidence, and hope. What gave them this confidence was the Exodus story, that ultimately God would save or rescue them, and also their identification of their own suffering with that of Christ's forsakenness on the cross. I'm told that during the apartheid years in South Africa, the most popular services were the Good Friday and Holy Saturday services because they could identify with Jesus and his pain, suffering, and desolation. Jesus understood the slaves, the oppressed, the anguish of apartheid, because he too knew misery, anguish, and forsakenness. And this resonance gave them the ability to endure and to hope. Just as the Israelites cried out to God about their pain and suffering, and the slave spirituals expressed their own despair, so can we share our pain, loss, and grief with God and with one another. Not only is lament a form of protest and resistance, but also it has the potential to be creative and generative as we slowly dare to find hope in the ruins. there can be treasure in the rubble. And then perhaps we can become a community of compassion and solidarity, inviting and pleading with God to be with us in this, to help us as we learn slowly and painfully how to be and then how to act and advocate within our communities. Lament can then lead to newness, to hope, and to imagining new things. British Congolese theologian and BAME mission and ministry enabler for the Diocese of Leicester, Lusa Nsenga Ngoy, gave a powerful example of this reimagining out of a space of past pain and lament when exploring Afrofuturism. This draws on African diasporic experience to reframe something new. He challenges us to think and dream of a world beyond what we have been taught or fed for so long. Drawing on the pain of Black history, Afrofuturism reimagines a future through Black culture and tradition. Lusa gives the example of Mallory Blackman's novel, Noughts and Crosses, where 21st century Britain is ruled by people of African descent, thereby inverting colonialism and empire. By taking the pain and injustice of past history, her novel helps us to release the imagination, to envision something different, and to imagine something new and restorative. Lusa writes, the use of imagination is not mere escapism, but a tool of resistance and resilience, helping to deconstruct the epistemology that commodifies and objectifies Black lives. So it can create a sense of agency and hope for a new and better future. For peoples who have experienced mission as a form of invasion, colonization, and mastery, lamenting this past, but also drawing on it in new and imaginative ways, can begin to interrupt the present and to reframe a liberative future. So that's my first idea, lament. Here's the second one. The missionary frontier is on our doorstep. This is something we've been forced to learn during the pandemic. We've had to stay local, and this has been a new and joyful discovery for many. Street WhatsApp groups have proliferated, neighbours have been watching out for one another, and we have learned to rely on our neighbours in new ways. Of course, the local is what our faith is all about. The incarnation is Jesus coming to live in our neighbourhood. Pope Francis expresses this with a delightful metaphor where he writes about a community in mission, which he calls an evangelizing community. It gets involved by word and deed in people's daily lives. It bridges distances, it's willing to abase itself if necessary, and it embraces human life, touching the suffering flesh of Christ and others. Evangelizers thus take on the smell of the sheep, and the sheep are willing to hear their voice. This metaphor could seem patronizing if we read it in terms of trying to do rather than to simply be, of trying to do to rather than to simply be. But I prefer to see it in terms of mutuality and learning, being involved in one another's lives, sharing our human condition to such an extent that we begin to smell like one another. Being local has opened up much for me, and unexpectedly, it has faced me with both the local and the global. Obviously, in lockdown, we've had to stay local, and I've only been able to meet one-to-one or in very small groups, whether that's been with our church home group online or with neighbours outside in a physically distanced way. This smallness has meant that we have experienced life and a level of intimacy that we did not know before. We have shared much of life together. We've been vulnerable, open, honest, and hospitable, even with the many restrictions. These seem to be key principles of mission. And of course, this is not all one way. I have shared my struggles and joys, as have they. I have offered and received hospitality, comfort, and support. We know that hospitality is a wonderful metaphor for mission, with its ambiguity and fluidity of host and guest, challenging many of our understandings of power and gift. Moreover, I have needed my neighbours. I have discovered sharing, mutuality, the enriching of community, because we've been pushed into a place of seeing our need of the other and the incompleteness of our own self-sufficiency. It has felt like we are learning what it means to be human together. It's made me wonder why it was never like this before the pandemic. Well, there's some obvious reasons. I was traveling to work, I was traveling around the world, and I never took much effort to get to know my neighbours. I was polite, but distant. I was too busy to get involved. Until now, I have never thought attentively about Jesus' second commandment. Does he literally mean love your neighbour as in the person next door? Probably, yes, certainly in his context and in his day. So this may be my first challenge. The missionary frontier is literally 5 steps away, the number of steps to my nearest neighbour's front door. And neighbours are always there. In fact, you may see your neighbours more than your own extended family. Neighbours can interrupt you. They can demand things from you. You actually cannot avoid them unless you choose to. English community theologian Anna Ruddock writes about this in a far more challenging context than where I live. She researched the stories of Christians who lived in a tough urban area, and she offers a vision of mission as happening through shared life and story. She adopts the phrase missional pastoral care, which she defines as a way of life that seeks to share in this mission of God by participating in communities who've been marginalised, developing significant and mutual relationships with people with an eye on the common good. She advocates 7 principles for this, and here they are: being among people who are different, living locally, being available, taking practical action, long-term commitment, slow rise, as Anna Hembry called it, consistency, and love. These principles suggest sharing life together, being known, and a long-term friendship and availability. She focuses strongly on the sharing of stories as a way to listen and to learn from one another. Stories and sharing lives are key principles for mission. In a small way, I have discovered this in the regular meetups and WhatsApp communications with my neighbours. It's slow, it's long-term, it's unpredictable because life happens. Perhaps we need more of this in mission, sharing our stories and our lives together in our neighbourhoods. Anna also reminds us that if it's messy, slow, and complicated, you're probably doing something right. Being with my neighbours has also reminded me of the global because of our own diversity. As a group of neighbours, we represent other ethnicities and nationalities, as well as other faiths or none. Diversity has many faces: cultural, racial, ethnic, gender, sexuality, differently abled, age, class, to name some. The pandemic has unmasked and starkly revealed these diversities. Because of our diversity and the racism one of our number has experienced, Black Lives Matter has become a key area for discussion. Recent publications have also alerted us yet again to our lack of awareness with respect to racial diversity, our institutional racism, and our white fragility. In my own ecclesial context, Black British Anglican priest, ADA Azariah France Williams, offers a searing critique of institutional racism in the Church of England. His book, Ghostship, is a kind of theology from below, prophetic, storytelling, poetic, full of stories, metaphor, anecdote, and imagination. Perhaps our missiology could look more like that. He offers some imaginative rereadings of biblical texts using the lens of Black theology. He also imagines some new ways forward. He suggests a Truth and Reparations Commission, which could be a sharing of stories, followed by recompense and maybe relationship. But he also wonders if that would be enough. what would that relationship be based on? He concludes rather bleakly that the Church of England, or the Cross and Crown Club, as he calls it, was not designed for people of colour. If you're ignored for long enough, the social death, the isolation, and the futility of your efforts for change silence you and sentence you to a form of living exile. We're becoming increasingly aware how white privilege and white supremacy have skewed and distorted mission for so long. Malawian missiologist Harvey Kwiyani claims, many white Christians' Jesus do not know how to relate with Black and brown people apart from oppressing them. 600 years of church history can testify. He maintains that mission, as we understand and practice it today, is a European creation, and that we need to learn to engage in mission without an attitude of superiority. He even calls this an adventure that can help us to rediscover mission. He writes, for mission agencies engaging in mission in a world where racism and white supremacy are discredited will be a new adventure for most of us, but I'm certain it will take us closer to mission as it was intended to be. The murder of George Floyd seems to have catalysed discussion and conscientised us to make it possible to talk about race and racism in ways that we didn't before. As we engage in mission, we need to take this opportunity to face our white fragility, to listen to how we have engaged in racism, and to learn how we can do better. How can we do better? What might that mean? Perhaps it means acknowledging exactly this, that mission has too often been framed by, or located in white colonialism. Willie James Jennings, an African-American author, calls this mastery. In his book, After Whiteness, where he claims that the role and purpose of theological education is to cultivate belonging, he explains that instead, theological education has become an exercise in mastery. Literally, it was the master training the master's son to run the plantation efficiently, to maintain order, to catalogue, delimit, define, and maximize the efficient use of slaves' bodies. What does this have to do with mission? Well, it's how the colonial masters see and saw the world. As Jennings explains elsewhere, these early Europeans in new places defined, they designated, they divided ancient tribal groupings, they created borders with straight lines, they developed racial categories, they challenged and destroyed the deeply held beliefs and practices of Indigenous peoples. For Indigenous peoples, the place is in them. They are the place, the land, the creation. I know this from my own country of Aotearoa, New Zealand, where the Māori people define themselves according to their place, their mountain, their river or sea, and their tribe. In the Māori language, the word for land and placenta is whenua. It's the same word. Māori are the land. The land is Māori. Jennings explains that for the early missionaries, they brought a very different understanding of how to be in the world. This crucial educational hope was to disabuse native peoples of any idea that lands and animals, landscapes and seasons carried any communicative or animate destiny, and therefore any ethical or moral direction in how to live in the world. Instead, they offered peoples a relationship with the world that was basically one-dimensional. We interpret and manipulate the world as we see fit, taking from it what we need and caring for it within the logics of making it more productive for us. This reminds me of this book, this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, has been my read of the lockdown. I loved this book. So Robin Wall Kimmerer is a botanist. She is an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And this reminds me of her explanation of the honourable harvest, which she talks about in this book. The honourable harvest respects creation and takes into account both the physical and metaphysical worlds. The honourable harvest offers guidelines in contrast to the state, which normally issues regulations with fines for illegal practice. Here are some of the guidelines from the honourable harvest. Know the ways of the ones who take care of you, so that you may take care of them. Introduce yourself. Be accountable as the one who comes asking for life. Never take the first. The biblical principle. Never take the last. Take only what you need. Harvest in a way that minimizes harm. Share. Give a gift in reciprocity for what you have taken. Sustain the ones who sustain you, and the earth will last forever. She too invokes the use of imagination. She writes, imagination is one of our most powerful tools. What we imagine, we can become. I like to imagine what it would be like if the honourable harvest were the law of the land today, as it was in our past. In stark contrast to this organic and generative vision, African-American author and social activist Bell Hooks names our current system as imperialist, white, supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, and explains how this is all part of an interlocking system of power which can oppress, marginalize, and exclude. She reminds us that all these systems are interconnected and that this is part of a global context, of the context of class, of empire, of capitalism, of racism, of patriarchy. This is true for my own country of Aotearoa, New Zealand, where these colonial and settler attitudes and practices, especially with respect to the land, are a continual open wound, both for the government and for CMS, Church Mission Society today. I can tell you more about that later if you want to know. Bell Hooks and Willie Jennings offer us a way forward, which is mediated through the concept of eros and the crowd. Hooks tells us that eros can be a powerfully motivating force and that it can provide an epistemological grounding, informing how we know what we know, and to use such ways to invigorate discussion and excite the critical imagination. Jennings writes about the crowd that surrounds Jesus and their desire for God. He reminds us of God's power to end hostility and to draw us and all of creation into reconciliation, so that we do not control, one that we do not control, but one that will recreate and reform us. This starts with community, the crowd. We fight against the segregation that shapes our world, he writes, and we work to weave lives together. He goes on to explore the concept of forming a contrast community. These communities must be formed on the actual ground in neighbourhoods and in living spaces. He claims that this is what mission is at its best, following Jesus into new places to form new life, life together in shared living spaces. So while the missionary frontier might be colonising language, I was confronted with it on my doorstep. Frontiers are local and global, especially as we are so interconnected and enmeshed in global systems. The pandemic has forced me to be much more present to my local and global contexts, and to begin to realise some of the challenges, complexities, and joys of that. Indeed, the neighbours on my doorstep have many faces. And as British performance poet Kay Tempest says, I can see your faces and I love people's faces. So on to my third one, This is a saying from John Taylor: cherish the weakness of limited means. With financial challenges already present and looming for the foreseeable future, we are learning to cherish the weakness of limited means. We are learning to cherish weakness and vulnerability, uncertainty, and our inability to fix things. When we do this, then the temptation to wield power and to collect capital is minimized. This is a challenge for the Church of England in particular, which over the centuries has accumulated massive assets, property, and developed a clericalized bureaucracy. Perhaps if the Church had been able to sit more lightly to both power and resources, we may look less like a multinational with assets, property portfolios, and investment managers, and more like the movement whose founder eschewed worldly power and resources. Limited means also has a beneficial side effect that we have to trust and rely on God rather than on our own resources. It forces us to be creative and innovative, imaginative and responsive as we work with the weakness of limited means rather than with limitless resources. Unsurprisingly, we're finding that this could put us in line with most of the rest of the world who are familiar with the reality of limited means. Former General Secretary of CMS, John Taylor, developed a new word to describe a quality of mind or a posture for engaging in mission that celebrates this. I don't actually think this word will take off, but it's quite a fun word. He writes about picnicity, from picnic, a preference for traveling light as if on a permanent picnic, knowing that what matters is the person, not the possessions, conviction, not convection. Knowing that what matters is the person, not the possessions, conviction, not convention. The ability to travel light and not to be cluttered by possessions is clearly linked to material poverty, as well as to a poverty of spirit. We do not have, either as creatures or as a planet, limitless resources, nor do we need them. I think we have all learned that enough is enough, and that we need to develop a theology of enough. We are learning that we need to respect the planet and not to be so consumerist and extravagant. So way back in 1972, 50 years ago nearly, John Taylor wrote, "Our Western way of life is marked by excess, whichever aspect of our situation one looks at, our consumption of food and our accumulation of goods, our wage claims and price rises, our waste and pollution, the concentration and congestion of our cities, our destruction of living creatures, and our plunder of fuels and minerals, our expenditure on armaments and the wanton disproportion of the way we use them. Excess is the word that comes continually to mind. Ruthless, unbridled, unthinking excess. Perhaps the pandemic has forced us to review our Western way of life and to ask some searching questions about it. What do we want our world and our communities to look like? Taylor called the Old Testament community the kingdom of right relationships, which embodied a theology of enough. Creditors were instructed to exercise restraint. All loans had to be interest-free, and every 7th year, all loans were forgiven. Have a look at Deuteronomy 15. Surely a community of right relationships, a beloved community as envisaged by Martin Luther King, or Jennings' crowd or contrast community, could model this as a community that is based on love, justice, simple living, and sharing. But a theology of enough does not mean a scarcity mindset. Too often we have succumbed to a scarcity mindset rather than looking for the resources that already exist in a community or context. Community theologians Al Barrett and Ruth Harley have discovered this in their work at Hodge Hill in Birmingham. So they write about a gift community to be discovered and shared. They write gifts within individual human beings, but also gifts that can be discovered in particular relationships, in groups and associations, in places and stories and traditions, in events and encounters, and in split-second moments. They go on to consider the assets that can be found in any community and assert that we can only find these when we begin to wait and see the place through our neighbour's eyes as well as through our own. It's a kind of slow rise or attentive listening that Anna and Fiona and others have talked about. North American researcher and sociologist Brené Brown believes that we live in a culture of scarcity, the never enough problem. And she maintains that the opposite of scarcity is not abundance, but rather the opposite of scarcity is enough, or what she calls wholeheartedness. According to Brené Brown, wholehearted living requires living with risk and uncertainty. I'll put this up here because this is her forthcoming book. She's written loads of books. She's a researcher on shame, and this book's coming out at the end of April. And I'm interested to see that she's doing it with a co-editor and looking at vulnerability and shame in the Black community. According to Brené Brown, wholehearted living requires living with risk and uncertainty. And to cultivate this, we need to practice creativity, resilience, gratitude and joy, play and rest, among other things. Along with an appreciation of gift, these are values and postures that we can take into our understanding of mission. The theology of enough encourages contentment, gratitude and humility, and fosters generosity. A theology of enough allows for give and take. If we could model these attitudes in our relationship with humanity, creatures, and the cosmos, then our mission might begin to look more humble, organic, and mutual. So to conclude, and then we have some time for discussion, what have I learned during the pandemic, and what might this mean for mission? So I have learned that sadness is part of our human condition, and that we need to sit with it and not to avoid it or deny it. I've learned that it's important to lament, and that this too is part of what it means to be human. How do we engage in mission in a world where the cracks have been blown open and exposed, and where the challenges of lockdown will be ongoing for so many in various ways? I have learned to begin to love my neighbours and to be loved. I have learned that so much of mission is constructed around a white imaginary, and that we need to dismantle and to reimagine that. And this means taking action, giving up power, and making sacrifices. And for those of us who are white, this might be God's greatest disruption in our lives, far more significant than COVID. I have learned that limited means can be a blessing, and that we need to develop and to practice a theology of enough. I acknowledge that I can say this from a privileged position, and that limited means and a theology of enough will look very different from the perspective of those who are struggling to get by. And I have learned that imagination is constrained by neither pandemics nor lockdowns, but only by the mind cages that we create. Yes, we're weary. Yes, this is a traumatic time in history, but we are also in an era of unprecedented change, which offers us an adventure of the imagination for mission. God is good, and the Spirit of God is hovering, waiting, expecting us to join in the adventure of mission, which is God's ongoing and just say that again. God is good, and the Spirit of God is hovering, waiting, expecting us to join in the adventure of imagination, which is God's challenging and gentle and ongoing mission. So thank you. We've got a bit of time, so maybe, Ali, do you want to put people into breakout groups, perhaps for 10 minutes, because you know that was a lot to take in, and you might need some time to.
While I do that, do you have any specific questions or themes that you want people to think about, or is this just a free-flowing chat?
I think just free-flowing. I mean, you're all grown-ups. I'm sure you've got your own ideas and responses and reactions. I mean, the three themes basically around lament, the neighbourhood, and all that is meant for me because of who my neighbours are, and challenging me to around issues of diversity and colonialism and mission, and then cherishing the weakness of limited means, what that might mean for us. But you'll have your own ideas and thoughts. So, you know, we've got plenty of time, so maybe 10 to 15 minutes of free-flowing discussion.
Right, off everyone goes.
Zuna would have found this sooner. You know, when you put something in the chat and then you press enter, because
count the cost, I think, sometimes of being a disciple of Christ, and I find it really heartbreaking. So having that revelation yourself, but then helping other people engage with it, are two totally different things, and that's the question I'm left with. How do we help other people to engage with this as a new way of life, albeit one that we should have been living for years anyway?
Yeah, I think that's a tough question. I mean, I think I'm tempted to give Anna's answer, Anna Hembry, which I think she said, change yourself. It's the beginning, the middle, and the end, because I guess in the end, it's up to the Spirit, isn't it? It's up to God, and we can't make other people change, and it's between them and God. Yes. I suppose it's, you know, it's what God is calling us to do. And as Jeff said, you know, we're white middle class, as I am. So yeah, it's challenging, it's costly. As you can tell from this presentation, I've done a lot of reading and thinking about race, because I've been a missionary. I come from Aotearoa, New Zealand, where there's a First Nations people, Indigenous people. It's really made me think a lot about mission and colonialism. I've been a missionary, so yeah, I've been there. I don't want to just all missionaries. I know what it's like to be a missionary. But, you know, there is the good, the bad, and the ugly, and we have to face up to that.
Yeah,
I've certainly seen colonialism at work. Doesn't mean it was all bad. Sorry.
No. Well, I was just going to say two things. I'm not middle class. So, you know, that assumption that because I'm white and I'm in the Church of England, I'm middle class. I'm not, and neither is every other white member of the Anglican Church middle class. Two, when we do things like these modules on mission, I don't know if it's because I'm from a Pentecostal background, but my mind is kind of conditioned to think about what's going to work on a big scale, and is something going to be upscalable. But actually, what God always speaks to me, and it's like Rosemary said about thinking about down and out, not up and in, is the mission of God, I think, is to the one. So, you know, if you to receive that revelation and to live it yourself, but then to not beat yourself up because 100,000 people aren't suddenly going to go, oh, that's amazing, we'll all do it. And I think it is a really slow burn, which in itself is part of the cost, isn't it? Is part of the sacrifice. Yeah,
thank you for that. And I come from a small country. I guess I'm a great fan of smallness, and one of CMS's founding principles is start small. So I think, and you know, Jesus talks about the mustard seed. There's a lot in the scriptures, I think, about smallness and hiddenness.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We've heard from groups 1 and 4 so far. Please do interject if you're from one of those groups and you want to add something. I thought maybe I was mistaken. I thought I saw Simon and Susie both making gestures as though they wanted to talk at some point. So was that right? No, not for Susie. Simon, if you're saying something, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Well, there's an issue that came up in our group on how far Christian values have become part of our culture. I mean, we said quite a lot about the sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, but the sinfulness of Western culture, let's call it. I think that's appropriate. But in our culture, there have been, over the centuries, a large input of Christian teaching and Christian formation. And many of the issues that have been identified, like, I mean, there's certain cultural sins, colonialism, but a lot of what we have identified as Christian have been part of what we would call Western values. You know, democracy, maybe, environmental sustainability, you know, equality of sexes and races. And so I'm just asking a question here about the kind of mission we engage in, because a lot of the mission that I see happening is mission that's outside of the church, engaged in by people who would not necessarily call themselves Christian, but they are engaged with issues that are Christian. So just raising that.
So what's your actual question, Simon?
Well, I'm just, you know, I'm trying to get at what you would call Christian mission, because a lot of what I see going on in the world, let's just take Greenpeace. That wasn't a Christian mission, but it's essentially Christian. I mean, there's nothing that you couldn't say was not Christian about what they are doing. And therefore, I'm confused. My children are involved in all sorts of issues, but they would not identify them as Christian. And my proposal is that our culture is so imbued with Christian values that what we would maybe want to call mission is actually just people getting engaged with the matters that are important to them because they come out of a Christian culture.
Yeah, I think that's a really good challenge. I mean, that's partly why the definition of mission that we put in the John Taylor book was a kind of broader one about a longing to see all things renewed. So yeah, there are plenty of people involved with that who are not necessarily Christians, who are doing all sorts of humanitarian, if you want to call it, and environmental work, who are not Christians. And we've seen that in the pandemic, I think, haven't we? We've seen people, perhaps the best and worst of people, we've seen people being very kind. All those volunteers at the beginning offering to work for the NHS, making, you know, PPE with 3D printers and all this sort of stuff. We've seen people want to do good and be helpful and be involved in the community. So it's a good question. What's the difference? I guess it comes back to motivation and how we understand what the world is and what the new heavens and the new earth means and what it means to live in relationship with Christ, I suppose. Kind of get back, actually Keith was talking about this in the break in a way, that he was asking if all the stories I gave in the first session, well, Keith, you're back. Would you like to put your question? I think it links.
I'm afraid I've missed the last bit because I had sound problem. I had to go out and come back in again. But what I was going to ask you after the first session was, I take it that's the question that you've got in your mind, I mean, one of the reasons why mission or evangelism is tricky these days is because I think there's a feeling that it's not, that people don't like you having designs on them, and we don't feel like we want to have designs on people. And I was wondering whether a risk of all those stories of operating via those different activities, like, you know, the nail bar and the boxing and so on, is that actually the risk of it is that it's a kind of disguised form of having designs on people. And what I asked you was, you know, do the people you're talking about think about that? How do they avoid that? Is that an issue? You know.
Yeah, so I mean, all the stories I gave, the people are overtly Christian, and some are vicars. So the people that they're working with know this, but often it's in a context outside church, and they're not so interested. You know, the end game is not necessarily to get people to come to church. The end game is this understanding of mission as the renewal of all things, but also, I think, to bring people into relationship with Christ. But they're not going to stop doing what they're doing or being friends or whatever with these people if they don't. It's but I think everybody knows that these people are Christians, so that's pretty clear from the outset. So I don't think it's covert or manipulative.
I thought I spotted Paul earlier with a question, and then we would hear from group 2. So people from group 3, we're going to be focusing on you next.
Just that it raises what Simon was saying, and it's a connection. I remember Stephen Sykes at Durham a long time ago raising this issue about what makes something Christian or not Christian in terms of mission. And one of the things he says, which I think we need to bring into the ring, is about motivation and intention. You know, what is it that's motivating us to act? And that intention and motivation is an important ingredient. If I go and feed someone as a Christian, and someone who's not a Christian goes and feeds the same person, what the difference? And what he was arguing was, well, it's what's my intention? What is my motivation? In other words, as a Christian, it has something to do with my life with God and my life with the church, possibly. So we haven't really looked in this discussion today the place of motivation and intention as an ingredient to what we've been talking about. That's my thought and question.
Thank you.
I think it's interesting to pick apart those two things, because they aren't the same, are they? So motivation is your driving force, right, for why you were doing something, and your intention is what you hope to achieve by doing something. So in a missional context, we might want to talk about the driving force, the motivation behind feeding a hungry person. From a Christian perspective, might be because of what I believe about God, what I believe about Jesus. You know, that's the driving force that leads me to go and do this thing. But that doesn't mean that my intention is then necessarily, you know, to convert this person after they've eaten the soup, you know. So the motivation and then the intention can be separated out in that way, I think.
Yeah, and I think we also need to remember the role of the Spirit and how the Spirit may be at work in somebody's life, and how aware a person may be of that or not. So that's another whole area of the place and role of the Spirit at work.
I think it's a helpful distinction when people want to characterize Christian mission as always looking like something that's uniquely Christian, whereas actually it might look like a lot of other things. But why you do it that matters. I think that's maybe what Paul's getting at. But I mean, I feel like that in the context of some of the things one might do in a parochial setting, and some of the things you might do for people might look just like what another agency might do at one level, and then you get people saying, well, we're not social services. And I think, well, he said, well, and I think exactly what you think there, Paul. It's about why you're doing it is what makes the difference, and what larger vision you're serving by doing it too, I think.
Michael, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say I do some voluntary work at a local food bank, and often people, when they receive their package of food, their food parcel, particularly if they've got children, I find they're often quite overwhelmed by it, sometimes a bit emotional, and they want to express thanks. They're grateful for what's been done for them, and they often ask, where does this food come from? Who donated it? They're just amazed, you know, how does this work? And we say, and which is just the truth, that the vast majority of it comes from local churches within the area, and they look just astounded, and they say, well, please say thank you to them from me. This is just wonderful. And you know, you just hope that gives them some kind of pause for reflection as to why people are doing this.
Yeah, thank you. Good example. Thank you.
Does anyone from group 3? If you don't know who you are, group 3, that's Catherine, Jane, Judy, and
we
Jane.
talked about quite a range of things. We were quizzing Catherine about what's happening in Northern Ireland at the moment. But we did end up at the end talking about whether the pandemic has made the church quite risk averse. I mean, the whole society in many ways is you know, the whole thing about isolation, social distancing. If you come to a service, you have to book in, you have to jump through all these hoops. Whether, I mean, I know mission isn't just about people coming to church, but whether we're going to have to relearn how to engage with the outside world. So, I mean, maybe we've learned a lot of very positive things about ourselves through the pandemic, but maybe also we've been kind of battening down the hatches, and it could have a negative impact on our involvement with the world.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. I mean, I think that you're probably right. The church perhaps has become more risk averse, maybe for obvious reasons. I think that if the church worried a bit less about the church and worried a bit more about the world, it might sort itself out, just sort of almost by default. So I think, I mean, that's why I framed this as an adventure of the imagination. I think that you can look on the pandemic as a kind of provocation or disruption, as Walter Brueggemann does, and an opportunity to reimagine. And I hope that the church might think like that, but that's going to take some courage and imagination and perhaps some resistance. So we'll see. I mean, it's hard when people are wanting to keep the show on the road, and that may take everybody's energies. But the church is called to more than that, I think.
Pete?
Still bothered about the motivation thing, if I'm honest. I'm just a little bit concerned that if my motivation's ever been right, and I also just did a piece on Karl Rahner, and I think he might say something about the fact that any act towards somebody is a response to the image of God in them. So then what does it mean when Jesus says about if you offer it in my name, you do it unto me? So those are my thoughts going around. I'm not sure quite as simple to say that Christians who are thinking missiologically somehow impart something that a non-Christian doesn't impart. I have problems with that. But then also I think I signed something as a Baptist minister that didn't agree with that once. So I'm a bit conflicted.
I think that's where thinking about the Spirit can help. John Taylor writes about
so.
that in The Go Between God, and you know, that the Spirit can be at work in people's lives without even in some ways consciously realizing it. Yeah. So I think the role of the Spirit there is important and helpful. Yeah. And what Simon started off by saying that, you know, his children, I think, you know, are not necessarily Christians, and yet they're not sure what they're involved in, but they might be involved in Amnesty International. They care about the planet, or they care about Black Lives Matter or Me Too, or some of these issues that have emerged recently. And, you know, they're trying to be involved in the renewal of the creation, really.
Yeah.
So, yeah, where does that leave them? I don't have any simple answers. I'll bow to Karl Rahner and other theologians.
I just want to add on Karl Rahner, because it is really pertinent to this conversation, that for Rahner, we're all naturally inclined towards God, and we may act on that inclination or we may act against that inclination, but the kind of ground of being human is that we're all kind of being drawn. We have this, not like a divine spark, but we have this desire to go towards God. Now, not all theologians think that, but Rahner certainly does.
I think that's quite if I've understood it correctly, this is oversimplifying things, but I think Roman Catholics have a much more creation-centered focus, which is, we're made in the image of God and therefore we have this goodness in us. Protestants seem to have a more redemption-centered focus, which is we're made in the image of God, but we are fallen and we need redemption. And of course, both of those are right, but where you land, where you put your emphasis does change your theology slightly, I think, and your practice. I see Helen has a question and Jeff.
And then we'll close after these two.
It's really much on the same point, really. I think that one of the problems with Christianity I've had over the years is that it seems to have this, well, it does have this opinion that it sees life as they're the only people who are doing good. And I think it's a lot wider than that, isn't it, really? And I think God works through a lot of different avenues. And I think that maybe the spirituality that we're seeing in society now is showing that a lot more. I think that the things you've been talking about today are all taking us forward in a positive way, but there's other things going on in other avenues that will also take us forward. And actually they still have God's kingdom there, but they're probably just not called that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks, Helen.
I just wanted to reflect on, again, I think a bit of Bonhoeffer's thinking about the idea that the church is not able to solve the world's problems, and it needs to recognize that its mission, like the Missio Dei, is God's mission, and it's about us drawing the world into Christ, not necessarily into church. And I think there's an issue of motives here around the whole, what are we trying to achieve by getting involved? I'm passionately committed to it, transforming our community, serving in food banks and every other kind of local ministry like that seems to be the right way forward. But what we've got to do is recognize that it's the participating with community, it's the walking with people, again in humility, not claiming to have all the answers, that actually does the paraklesis thing. It enables us and therefore Christ to come alongside people. And it's not about solving the problems. And if we think that's what the church is there to do, we'll be a big disappointment to the world and indeed to ourselves.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your attentiveness and concentration. It's been good to be with you this morning. I'll hand back to Ellie.
Thanks, Cathy. Before we go any further, let's just thank Cathy for this morning. Cathy, I think you've really given us a lot to think about as we continue our week's reflection on imagination, on the church, on our changing culture. So thank you very much, and we'll be putting Cathy's presentation up on Serum Learn, so you'll have access to all of those resources and be able to read through again what she's shared with us this morning. So thank you so much, Cathy, for that. We are regrouping at 2 on a new Zoom link. Please go and check for that on Serum Learn. And all of these sessions are being recorded, so you'll also be able to review if needed. Keith, is there anything else that we need to mention at this point?
I don't think so. I'll try and get a couple more of the videos from the other 2 videos from yesterday up on Serum Learn during the lunch break. But otherwise, no, I don't think so.
Brilliant. Okay, so we reconvene at 2 to hear from Keith.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.